I got a message that Aileen wanted me to come meet her at the local jail. She had something to say.
Okay, I cannot go in the execution chamber and die in the execution chamber as a liar. And I cannot go in the execution chamber and be executed under the devil. I have to come clean and cleanse my spirit in the name of Jesus Christ.
On the morning of October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. She was 46 years old. She declined a last meal. She asked only for a cup of coffee. Her final words were, "I'd just like to say, I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Nobody knew what to say to that. Nobody ever did. Here is what you need to know before anything else. The first man Aileen Wuornos killed had served 10 years in a prison mental institution for violent rape. This information existed in federal criminal records before her trial. It was not presented to the jury that sentenced her to death for killing him. They executed her without the jury ever knowing. The question of whether that execution was just has never been answered. That is not the whole story. The whole story is considerably more complicated, and the complication does not resolve in her favor on every count. But it begins there, with a woman on trial for her life, and the most relevant fact about the crime she was charged with sitting in a federal database that nobody chose to search. This is the story of Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, a suburb northeast of Detroit. February 29th, a leap day, existing only once every 4 years, is a fact that people constructing a narrative about her life have sometimes treated as symbolic. It probably isn't. What is significant is not the date, but the specific circumstances of the family she was born into, which were, from the beginning, about as unfavorable as circumstances can be while still technically constituting a family. Her mother was Aileen Wuornos, who was 14 years old when she married and 16 years old when Aileen was born. 16 years old, married for 2 years, with a newborn and an older toddler, and a husband who had already left. Aileen Wuornos was, in other words, a child who had been failed by the people responsible for her before she became a person who failed her own children. Her father was Leo Dale Pittman, who was 20 years old when Aileen was born and who was not present for her birth or for any part of her life. He had separated from Diane before the birth. In 1967, when Aileen was 11 years old, Leo Pittman was convicted in Kansas of the rape and attempted murder of a 7-year-old girl and was sentenced to life in prison. 2 years later, in 1969, he hanged himself in his prison cell. Aileen never met him. The father she never met was a convicted child rapist who killed himself in prison. This is the genetic and biographical inheritance that Aileen Wuornos was born with. Not an explanation. Not an excuse. A set of facts that the people who would later argue about what she was and what she deserved would handle in very different ways. When Aileen was approximately 4 years old, her mother Diane could no longer manage the situation she was in, a teenager trying to raise 2 children with no support, no money, no partner. And she left. She signed over legal custody of Aileen and her older brother Keith to her own parents, Laurie and Britta Wuornos, and disappeared from her children's lives. Aileen and Keith were not told that Laurie and Britta were their grandparents rather than their parents. They were introduced to everyone as Laurie and Britta's children, told to call them Mom and Dad, raised within the family fiction that their mother had never existed. This was the second family secret of Aileen's first 4 years of life. The first was the existence and nature of her father. The second was the identity of her mother. Both were arranged to protect adults from consequences and imposed on children who had no power to question them. The Wuornos household in Traverse County was not warm. Laurie Wuornos was an alcoholic, and the specific quality of his alcoholism, the moods, the rages, the unpredictable shifts between periods of relative calm and periods of violence, organized the household around his management. Aileen later described both physical and sexual abuse by her grandfather. These claims were denied by Laurie Wuornos and by some family members, and the truth of what happened inside that household is knowable only from Aileen's own testimony, which was not always consistent. What is not disputed by anyone who knew Aileen as a child is that she was troubled. She exhibited unusual sexual behavior from a very early age, trading sexual contact with neighborhood boys for cigarettes and food when she was 9 or 10 years old. Childhood friends described her as someone who did not behave like other children, who seemed not to understand the normal social limits around physical contact and sexual behavior. These behaviors, in a child of that age, are clinical indicators of sexual abuse. They are not proof, but they are not nothing. By the time she was in middle school, she was known in the neighborhood as a girl who would trade sex for money or cigarettes or food. This was not something she had invented. This was something she had been taught in the household where she grew up, was how the world worked and what she was for. When she was 14 years old, a friend of her grandfather raped her. She became pregnant. She was sent to a home for unwed mothers in Michigan, where she gave birth to a son in January of 1971. The child was given up for adoption immediately. She returned to the Wuornos household. Shortly afterward, the precise timing varies in different accounts, Laurie Wuornos expelled her from the house. She was 14 or 15 years old. She had recently given birth. She had been sent away and returned and was now expelled entirely. She moved into the woods near the family home. This is not a metaphor. She lived in the woods, sleeping in an abandoned car at some point, surviving through whatever she could find or trade for. She had no money, no legal ability to work, no family who would take her in. Her grandmother Britta, who had shown her more warmth than Laurie, died in 1971, the same year as the birth. Keith, her brother, was the one person who seemed to genuinely care for her, but he was also young and dependent and unable to provide what she needed. She started hitchhiking. She moved south eventually toward Florida, which was where the work was and where the weather allowed for the kind of life she was living. She used sex work as her primary means of income, not because she chose it in any meaningful sense of the word choose, but because it was the only trade she had been given any preparation for, and the one that produced cash quickly from men who were willing to pay. She was 16 when she left Michigan. She was 18 when she hitchhiked to Florida. She carried a .22 caliber revolver in her purse from early on, because the work she was doing was dangerous, and the men who picked her up on the roads of Florida were not always the clients they presented themselves as. That gun would kill 7 people between 1989 and 1990. Before that, there were more than 2 decades of roads and bars and arrests and cheap motels, and a brief marriage, and the accumulation of a life that nobody had taught her how to construct any other way. In 1974, she was arrested in Caddo County, Oklahoma, for driving under the influence and firing a weapon from a vehicle. In 1976, her brother Keith died of throat cancer. He was 21. He was the person she described most consistently as someone who had genuinely cared about her. Also, in 1976, she married Louis Gratz Fell. He was 69 years old, the president of a yacht club in Merritt Island, Florida. She was 20 years old. The marriage was, by any standard, a disaster within weeks. She continued working the bars and getting into fights. She abused Fell physically, reportedly beating him with his own cane when he tried to discipline her. He had the marriage annulled 9 weeks after it began. He obtained a restraining order against her. she returned to the highways. The following years produced a lengthening record. In 1977, she was arrested in Antwerp, Ohio, for assault and disturbing the peace. In 1981, she was arrested for armed robbery in Edgewater, Florida, and served 13 months in prison. It was her only significant incarceration before 1991. She attempted suicide multiple times. The rap sheets that accumulated had a recurring notation in the field for attitude: poor. This is, perhaps, the most honest thing the system ever recorded about Aileen Wuornos. Her attitude toward the people arresting her was poor. Her attitude toward the system processing her was poor. Her attitude toward a world that had given her what it had given her was, by this point, understandably poor. In 1986, in a bar in South Daytona, Florida, she met a woman named Tyria Moore. Tyria was 24 years old, and she was everything Aileen was not in the specific ways that make two people find each other across a crowded bar. She was cheerful. She was emotionally grounded in the way that people are grounded when they have grown up with the ordinary stability of families that function. She was looking for connection, and she found it in Aileen, who, despite everything, was also looking for it. They moved in together. Aileen supported them both through sex work along the Florida highways. Tyria worked occasional jobs, motel maid, odd work, but Aileen was the primary earner. This arrangement continued for 3 years. They had a relationship that, by the accounts of people who knew them, was genuinely affectionate. Not functional in the conventional sense, not stable, but real. The specific reality of two people who had chosen each other. Aileen later said that Tyria Moore was the only person she had ever loved. She killed her first man in late November of 1989. She was 33 years old. She had been on the road for nearly 2 decades. She had been arrested multiple times. She had been processing, through whatever mechanisms were still available to her, the specific accumulated damage of a life that had contained almost no safety. What happened in late November of 1989 on a remote stretch of highway in Florida is the question that Aileen Wuornos' case has been asking ever since. Richard Mallory was 51 years old, an electronics store owner from Clearwater, Florida. On November 30th, 1989, he picked up a woman hitchhiking on a highway in Volusia County. What happened after he pulled over depends entirely on whose account you accept, and the fact that the accounts differ on every significant point is the central fact of the Aileen Wuornos case. Aileen Wuornos' account, given at her trial and in multiple subsequent interviews, was specific and consistent in its outlines. Mallory drove to a remote wooded area under the pretext of a private place for their transaction. Once there, he became violent. He beat her, he handcuffed her, he raped her, he sodomized her. The assault was sustained and brutal. She managed to reach the gun she kept in her purse during the struggle, and she shot him 4 times. She then took his car and his wallet. The prosecution's account was that Wuornos had targeted Mallory as a robbery victim, had used sex work as a pretext to get into his car and drive to a remote location, and had shot him to take his car and money. A premeditated robbery murder, the first in a pattern of 7. Both accounts agree on the facts that can be established objectively. Mallory picked her up. They drove to a remote location. He was shot 4 times. She took his car and his money. The question of which account reflects what actually happened is a question that the jury at Wuornos' trial answered against her. It is also a question that became considerably more complicated after the trial, when a Dateline NBC reporter named Michelle Gillen discovered in November of 1992 what the prosecution had not told the jury. Richard Mallory, in 1957, had broken into a woman's home in Maryland, grabbed her from behind, and attempted to sexually assault her. He had been charged with assault with intent to rape. He had pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity and had served a decade in a prison mental institution before his release. He had a documented, adjudicated history of violent sexual predation going back 30 years. Investigators on the Wuornos case had specifically and directly denied, before her trial, that any evidence existed to corroborate her claims about Mallory's history of violence. Had they searched federal criminal records, as standard investigative practice suggested they should when evaluating a defendant's self-defense claim, they would have found this history. They did not search the records, or they searched them and did not disclose what they found. The record on this point is not entirely clear, and the detectives who could have clarified it resigned from the force shortly after the trial to pursue book and movie deals related to the case. The evidence that the first man Aileen Wuornos killed was a convicted violent sex offender with a documented history of the exact kind of crime she accused him of was not presented to the jury that sentenced her to death for killing him. This is not a minor procedural point. In the legal tradition of the United States, a defendant who claims self-defense is entitled to present evidence that supports that claim, including evidence of the alleged victim's history of violence. The jury that convicted Wuornos of Mallory's murder was asked to evaluate a self-defense claim without the most directly relevant piece of corroborating evidence that existed. Whether this rises to the level of prosecutorial misconduct is a legal question that the courts were asked and answered in ways that did not benefit Wuornos. Whether it constitutes something wrong, whether a jury should have known this, is a different kind of question, and the answer to that question is yes, they should have known. They weren't told. The 6 men after Mallory were David Spears, 47, found shot in Citrus County in June of 1990. Charles Carskadden, 40, found in Pasco County in June of 1990. Troy Burris, 50, found in Marion County in July. Charles Humphreys, 56, a child abuse investigator, found in Marion County in September. Peter Seams, 65, a missionary who disappeared in June and whose body was never recovered. Walter Antonio, 62, a trucker and reserve police officer, found in Dixie County in November. 6 men, all shot with the same .22 caliber revolver. All their cars and possessions taken. All found along Florida highways or in remote areas of central Florida between June and November of 1990. About these 6 men, Wuornos' account was less clear than it was about Mallory. At trial, she claimed self-defense for all of them, that each had attacked her or threatened to attack her. Later, in the statement she made after pleading no contest to 3 of the murders, she said something that suggested a more complicated truth. "I wanted to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violently rape me, as I've told you, but these others did not. They only began to start to. They only began to start to." This is, in its way, the most precise description she ever gave of what was happening in her mind when she killed those 6 men. Not that they attacked her, not that she attacked them for money, that something they did, a movement, a tone, a look, a word, triggered a response in her that felt, in the moment, like the recognition of a threat. Whether that response was accurate perception or traumatic misperception is a clinical and philosophical question that the legal system treated as irrelevant. The legal system had a category, premeditated murder. She had killed 6 men for money. Category applied. The category may not have been wrong about what happened. It was almost certainly incomplete about why. Between the first murder in November 1989 and Wuornos' arrest in January 1991, 14 months passed. In those 14 months, she killed 7 men, drove their cars, pawned their belongings under various names, and continued living in the motels and cheap apartments that she and Tyria Moore occupied along the Florida Gulf Coast. The life she was living was not invisible. She and Moore moved regularly, changing addresses, staying in different places as situations required. Wuornos worked the highways, hitchhiking, or standing at the roadside in a way that identified her to drivers who were looking for what she was offering. She had been doing this for 15 years. She knew the rhythms of it, the signals, the negotiations, the specific geography of a transaction conducted in the front seat of a stranger's car on a remote Florida road at night. What she was also doing, from late 1989 onward, was killing some of those strangers. David Spears was 47 years old, a construction worker from Orlando, when he picked up a woman hitchhiking on Interstate 75 in May of 1990. His truck was found in Citrus County. His body was found 6 miles away, shot 6 times with a .22 caliber revolver. His belongings were gone. Charles Carskadden was 40 years old when he disappeared in May of 1990 near Wildwood. He was driving from Missouri to Tampa. His body was found in Pasco County, shot 9 times. He had a .45 automatic revolver in his car. It was gone when his body was found. Troy Burris was 50 years old, a sausage delivery driver for Gilchrist County when he disappeared in July of 1990. He was found in Marion County, shot twice. His delivery truck had been driven away from the scene by someone. Charles Humphreys was 56 years old, a retired Air Force major and former child abuse investigator when he disappeared in September of 1990. He was found shot 6 times in Marion County. He had a police badge in his car when he was killed. He is notable in the sequence not because his story was different from the others, but because he was a child abuse investigator, someone whose professional life had been spent protecting children from the kind of abuse that Wuornos had experienced throughout her childhood. Whether this connection meant anything to her, or whether she simply saw an older man who had stopped to pick her up, is unknown. Walter Antonio was 62 years old, a trucker and reserve police officer when he was killed in November of 1990 in Dixie County. He was the last of the confirmed victims. His car was found first. His body was found in the woods 3 days later. Peter Seams, 65, a missionary from Jupiter, Florida, disappeared in June of 1990. His body was never found. His car was the one that Wuornos and Moore crashed in Marion County in July, producing the composite sketches that would eventually lead to the identification. 7 men, ranging in age from 40 to 65, all picked up along the highways of central Florida by a woman with a gun in her purse who had been, in the language of the media coverage, working as a prostitute. The phrase in the media coverage was accurate, but functioned in the coverage as a moral judgment, as a way of framing the women who did this work as somehow outside the ordinary protections of law and expectation. The unstated implication was that women who hitchhiked and offered sex for money along Florida highways were in some way out of the protected category. The legal system did not explicitly say this. The legal system said it through the evidence it chose to present and the evidence it chose to withhold, through the witnesses it chose to give immunity to and the defendant it chose to execute, through the specific framing of a woman who had been sexually abused since before she could count as someone who had no legitimate claim to defend herself against the next person who tried to abuse her. This is the argument. It is not a comfortable argument. It does not resolve the deaths of 6 men who, so far as the available evidence establishes, were not violent predators, but it is not without foundation in the record. Bodies kept appearing along the same corridor of central Florida highways. The victims were middle-aged men, all shot, all found near or in remote wooded areas off major roads. All had been robbed. The weapon was the same, a .22 caliber revolver, but investigators working different county jurisdictions were not yet sharing information in a way that connected the cases to each other. In July of 1990, an incident occurred that would eventually break the case. Wuornos and Moore crashed the car of Peter Seams in an accident in Marion County. 2 women were seen leaving the scene. Witnesses provided descriptions, and composite sketches were produced and circulated to the media statewide. The sketches showed a tall, thin, fair-haired woman and a shorter, heavier woman. The sketches looked exactly like Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore. Moore saw the sketches. She recognized them both. She left Florida shortly afterward and returned to her family in Pennsylvania without telling Wuornos she was going. By late 1990, investigators from multiple counties had begun comparing their cases and had identified the connection. Same weapon, same victim profile, same geographic corridor. They also had the composite sketches from the car accident, and they had porn records going back through 1989 and 1990 that showed a woman using multiple aliases, selling items that were later identified as belonging to the murder victims. The investigation closed on Aileen Wuornos. The investigation closed in late 1990. Investigators identified Wuornos through the porn records and the composite sketches combined. On January the 9th, 1991, she was arrested on an outstanding warrant at the Last Resort, a biker bar in Volusia County. She was sitting at the bar having a conversation, drinking. She did not resist. She did not know in that moment that the warrant was being used as a pretext to take her into custody for 7 murders. Tyria Moore was located the following day in Scranton, Pennsylvania, having returned to her home state after the investigation began. Investigators offered her immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation. Moore accepted. She agreed to make recorded phone calls to Wuornos. The calls were made over 3 days. Moore's approach in the calls was to express distress about her own legal situation, to tell Wuornos that she was afraid of being charged with crimes she hadn't committed, that she needed Wuornos's help to clear her name. Wuornos, in the calls, was primarily concerned with protecting Moore. She said in one recorded call, "I'm not going to let you go to jail. Ty, I love you. If I have to confess everything just to keep you from getting in trouble, I will." And she did. 3 days after the phone calls, Wuornos confessed to all 7 murders and took sole responsibility for all of them. The calls were played at her trial. Moore testified against her. The woman Wuornos had said was the only person she had ever loved helped put her on death row. Moore later received book and movie deals for her account of the relationship. So did 3 detectives on the case, who subsequently resigned from the force. Wuornos's trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began on January 13, 1992. It lasted 2 weeks and was covered extensively by the national media, which had framed the case from the beginning in a way that reflected more about the media's assumptions than about the actual complexity of what was being tried. The coverage had called her the hooker from hell. It had called her America's first female serial killer, a label that is factually debatable since women had committed serial murders in America before Wuornos. But that served the media's interest in treating her case as unprecedented and therefore maximally sensational. The coverage focused on her appearance, her manner, her lesbianism, and the violence of the crimes in a way that produced a public understanding of Aileen Wuornos as a figure of pure malevolence before the trial had even begun. The jury selection process produced a jury that had been exposed to this coverage and that entered the courtroom with a fully formed narrative already available. Wuornos's defense attorneys urged her not to testify. A defendant in a criminal trial has an absolute right under the Fifth Amendment not to take the stand, and a jury is instructed not to draw any inference from a defendant's silence. The practical reality is that defendants who testify in their own defense in capital murder cases take a significant risk. They open themselves to cross-examination by prosecutors who have prepared extensively for exactly this moment, and they give the jury an opportunity to form a direct impression of them under adversarial conditions. Wuornos insisted on testifying. She took the stand and described in detail what she claimed Mallory had done to her. She was a poor witness in the technical sense. She became agitated. Her answers wandered. She invoked her Fifth Amendment rights 25 times during cross-examination rather than answer questions she found uncomfortable or threatening. The jury watched a woman on the stand who seemed, in the conventional presentation of a witness, unpredictable and difficult to read. What the jury did not know, because they were not told, was that the man she was describing as her attacker had been convicted of violent sexual assault in another state and had served a decade in a mental institution for it. She was convicted of first-degree murder on January 27, 1992. She was sentenced to death 4 days later. At the sentencing, psychiatrists testified that she was mentally unstable. The judge sentenced her anyway. Over the following year, Wuornos entered a series of additional pleas that completed the legal resolution of the remaining cases. In March of 1992, she pleaded no contest to the murders of Spears, Humphreys, and Burris, receiving 3 more death sentences. In November of 1992, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Carskadden and received a 5th death sentence. In February of 1993, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Antonio and received a 6th. 6 death sentences, 1 woman, 14 months. There is something that happened at the edges of the legal proceedings that the case record typically treats as a footnote, but that deserves direct attention. The lead detectives on the investigation negotiated television and book deals for their account of the case while the trial was ongoing. The deals became public. The detectives resigned from the force. Tyria Moore, who had been granted immunity in exchange for cooperating with the investigation and testifying against Wuornos, also negotiated book and movie deals for her account of the relationship. The woman who had confessed to 7 murders to protect Moore from prosecution received nothing. Moore received money. The 3 detectives had a financial interest in the conviction of Aileen Wuornos. The girlfriend who provided the critical recorded confession had a financial interest in the conviction of Aileen Wuornos. Neither party disclosed these interests during the proceedings. Whether any of this constitutes legal misconduct that would have affected the verdict is a question the courts were asked and answered against her. Whether it constitutes something wrong, something that a reasonable person looking at the full picture would identify as a system functioning in the interest of the people running it, rather than the person being processed through it, is a different question. The answer to the different question is yes. At each plea, she made statements that the prosecution and the media interpreted as confirmation of premeditation, and that her defenders interpreted as the increasingly unmoored testimony of a severely traumatized person who was, in her confusion and her determination to get it over with, producing whatever version of the narrative seemed to be required of her at that particular moment. At one of the pleas, she said directly, "I robbed them, and I killed them as cold as ice, and I would do it again. And I know I would kill another person, because I've hated humans for a long time." This statement was quoted extensively in the media and in subsequent accounts of her crimes. It was taken as a confession of motive that disposed of the self-defense claim permanently. What the same accounts often did not quote was what came before and after it. The disorganized, oscillating, contradictory testimony of a woman who was simultaneously trying to protect her girlfriend, satisfy her attorney, satisfy the prosecution, satisfy her own need to have someone believe what Mallory had done to her, and manage a mental and emotional state that had been deteriorating throughout the proceedings. She was, in other words, saying different things at different times for different reasons, and the legal system recorded the things that served the prosecution's narrative and treated the things that complicated it as irrelevant. The feminist argument about the Wuornos case is not that she was innocent. It is simpler and harder than that. It is that the evidence of Richard Mallory's history was withheld, that the investigators sold their story while building hers, that the girlfriend who betrayed her was given immunity and a book deal, that the system that had processed Aileen Wuornos through rape and poverty and jails and highways for 40 years then executed her for defending herself against a man whose violence was documented and suppressed. Whether this is what happened exactly is a question the courts addressed against her. Whether it is what happened in spirit is a question with a less tidy answer. She killed 7 men. She grew up in a house where she was raped before she was a teenager. She killed her first victim in circumstances where the victim had a documented history of the exact crime she accused him of. She was convicted of that killing without the jury being told. She was executed. She asked for coffee. She had 11 actual birthdays in 46 years of life. Her ashes are in Michigan, scattered by the one childhood friend who stayed, the person who had known her before the roads and the guns and the courts, who took what was left and put it somewhere that had once been home. The system got what it wanted. She got a cup of coffee. The question of whether those two things are the same as justice is the question her case has been asking since 2002. Nobody has answered it. Nobody can. She said her last words about sailing with the Rock and returning with Jesus on June 6th. She was pronounced dead at 9:47 in the morning. She was 46 years old. She had been born on February 29th, 1956, a day that only exists once every 4 years. She had only had 11 actual birthdays in the 46 years of her life. Her childhood friend Dawn Botkins scattered her ashes on property in Tuscola County, Michigan, her home state, the place she had left as a teenager and never returned to as anything other than a fugitive or a memory. She had been asking for very little for a very long time. At the end, she asked for coffee. The question that her case leaves open is not whether she killed 7 men. She did. The question is what her case was actually about, and the fact that this question is still being asked 23 years after her execution suggests that the legal resolution, which was swift and decisive, was not the same thing as a resolution. The prosecution presented her case as simple: a sex worker who had targeted motorists for robbery and killed them for money. 7 premeditated murders. A serial killer by any applicable definition. Her defenders, including the feminist scholars and advocates who took up her case in the years after her conviction, the documentary filmmakers who pursued her story, and the writers who examined the trial record in detail, presented it differently. A woman who had been subjected to sexual violence from before she could read, who had survived by whatever means were available, who had killed her first victim in circumstances where the evidence strongly supported that she was telling the truth about being attacked, and whose subsequent killings occurred in a state of accumulated psychological damage so severe that the distinction between genuine threat and anticipated threat had become, for her, genuinely impossible to maintain. Both accounts contain things that are true. The feminist argument about the Wuornos case is not that she was innocent. It is that her case was evaluated by a system that treated the violence she had experienced as irrelevant to the violence she committed. That the 40 years of rape and abuse and abandonment that preceded the killings were not considered mitigating in any meaningful way by the legal process that sentenced her to death, and that the same system that had subjected her to violence throughout her life then executed her for responding to it. This argument is not without its problems. 6 of the 7 men she killed were not Richard Mallory. Whether they attacked her or threatened her or simply seemed to her traumatized perception as threatening is not established by evidence, and the claim that all 6 were legitimate self-defense requires accepting a version of events that Wuornos herself ultimately could not maintain consistently. But the argument also has things in it that are difficult to dismiss. The Mallory evidence was withheld. The investigators profited from her story. The girlfriend who betrayed her was given immunity and also profited. The legal system that sentenced Aileen Wuornos to death for killing a man who had spent 10 years in a mental institution for violent rape did not tell the jury the most relevant fact about the case it was deciding. Whether this constitutes a miscarriage of justice in the formal legal sense, courts decided it did not. Whether it constitutes something that a reasonable person would call unjust is a different question, and the answer to that question is considerably less clear. Charlize Theron won the Academy Award for Best Actress for her portrayal of Wuornos in the 2003 film Monster, released the year after the execution. The film presented a sympathetic version. Wuornos, as a person fundamentally shaped by abuse and trauma, who killed Mallory genuinely in self-defense and who became unable to stop because something had broken in her. It was not the whole truth. It was not entirely inaccurate. It introduced a generation of viewers to a version of the case that was more complicated than the media coverage of 1991 and 1992 had been willing to be. The women's rights organizations that took up Wuornos's case in the years following her conviction were making an argument that extended beyond her specific circumstances, that the legal system systematically fails women who use violence in self-defense, particularly women who have been in contexts of sustained sexual exploitation, that the categories available to the system, victim or perpetrator, self-defense or murder, are not adequate to describe the reality of a life like Aileen Wuornos's, and that the failure of the system to find an adequate category should not be resolved by pretending the complexity doesn't exist. This argument, too, is still being made. The case produced in the years after the execution a specific kind of scholarly and cultural attention. Books, academic papers, feminist analyses, documentary films, a stage musical, a feature film that won an Academy Award. All of them grappling with the same question from different angles. How do you think about a woman who was a victim and a killer, who told the truth about some things and lied about others, who was damaged in ways that the legal system had no mechanism for evaluating, who killed people she should not have killed, who may have been executed for a murder she committed in genuine self-defense? The answer is that you keep asking the question. You don't resolve it. You sit with the fact that it resists resolution. She was perhaps both. A woman who had been genuinely victimized throughout her life, who killed her first victim in circumstances that a jury should have been allowed to fully evaluate with all available evidence, who then continued killing in a psychological state that the legal system called premeditated murder, and that the most generous reading of the clinical evidence called something considerably more complicated. She was also 7 men's killer, and the 6 men after Mallory did not have records suggesting they deserved what happened to them. Both things are true. Both things have been true from the beginning. The case of Aileen Wuornos is a case about what happens when a legal system applies a clean binary, victim or perpetrator, innocent or guilty, to a situation that does not have a clean binary at its core. She had 11 actual birthdays in 46 years. She asked for a cup of coffee. She is gone. The question of what she was and what was owed to her is not gone. It is still here. It may always be.